The courtroom held its breath. Judge Amy Coney Barrett's words still clung to the air, sharp and metallic, slicing through the silence like the edge of a blade. The weight of her rebuke lingered, an echo bouncing off marble walls and settling heavy on every shoulder in the chamber. For a moment, even the scratch of pens ceased. Reporters frozen mid-note, their eyes darting between the bench and the defense table where Representative Jasmine Crockett sat. A camera flash pierced the pause, capturing Crockett's face in stark relief. Her eyes steady, her jaw set not with anger, but with a restrained fire that refused to be extinguished. She did not flinch. She did not break. Where others might have faltered under the glare of judicial power, Crockett remained still, her silence itself a defiance, her composure a rebuke sharper than any word she might yet speak. Barrett shifted slightly in her seat, the black robe draped across her shoulders like an unchallenged crown. Her voice, moments earlier, had rung out with the confidence of someone used to winning every exchange. It was a voice dripping with superiority, carrying not just authority, but disdain, meant to wound, meant to diminish. She had attacked with the smug certainty that her gavel was final, that her word was law. And for the briefest of moments, it seemed as though the chamber had bowed to her command. But silence is deceptive. Beneath it, tension curled tighter, like a wire pulled to its breaking point. Those in the gallery felt it, a current running under their skin, a sense that something was shifting. Reporters glanced toward Crockett again, sensing the storm gathering behind her calm. Even the bailiff, stoic by training, leaned forward almost imperceptibly, as though bracing for impact. Crockett lifted her chin, her eyes locking on Barrett's with quiet precision. There was no tremor in her breath, no hint of retreat. Instead, there was the steady strength of someone who had endured harder nights, sharper insults, heavier burdens. And in that gaze was the unspoken promise that words were coming. Words that would not just answer the attack, but unravel the very foundation it stood on. No one in that chamber, least of all Barrett, could have predicted what Crockett was about to unleash. This trial was never just about the statutes printed on parchment or the sterile arguments filed in briefs. It was about something older, heavier, more deeply woven into the nation's veins. Every word spoken in that courtroom carried with it the weight of America's identity. Who belonged, who mattered, who would be heard. The marble columns weren't just architecture. They stood as symbols of a history that had too often silenced voices like Jasmine Crockett's while amplifying those cloaked in titles and privilege. Amy Coney Barrett embodied that tradition with every syllable. She was the face of an old guard, polished, precise, rooted in authority that reached back through decades of rulings and centuries of inherited power. Her robe was not just cloth, but a banner of elitism, a signal that she could shape lives with the swing of a gavel. She spoke not as one searching for truth, but as one convinced she already owned it. To Barrett, the courtroom was a stage where she never doubted her starring role, but seated opposite her was a different figure, cut from a different cloth. Jasmine Crockett did not arrive cloaked in inherited power. She came with the resilience born of struggle, of knowing what it means to be underestimated, of walking into rooms where every glance seemed to say she didn't belong. To the untrained eye, she might have appeared outmatched, one woman against the gravitas of the bench. But to anyone paying attention, it was clear. Crockett carried the weight of the people, the unheard, the overlooked. Her presence alone disrupted the script the old guard expected to play out. This was the clash at the heart of the trial. It wasn't lawyer versus judge. It wasn't even argument versus ruling. It was two Americas colliding, one clinging to the security of hierarchy, the other demanding recognition of dignity. Barrett represented a legal tradition that had two ears, often wrapped its authority in exclusion. Crockett stood as the embodiment of every voice that tradition had sought to sideline. And in the silence after Barrett's attack, that contrast became unmistakable. The stakes were not limited to the outcome written into court records. They lived in the ripple effect beyond those walls, in living rooms where immigrant families would ask whether justice could truly protect them, in classrooms where young people would decide if they still believed in fairness, in headlines that would define which America the world saw that day. This wasn't just another heated exchange. It was the moment that would decide who truly controlled the narrative of justice. Would it remain in the hands of the robe, cold and distant? Or would it shift to the voice of a fighter who had clawed her way into that chamber not for herself, but for the millions she mirrored? The nation held its breath, watching and waiting, because everyone knew what happened next would echo far beyond the walls of that courtroom. Amy Coney Barrett did not rise to power by accident. She was groomed for it, heralded as a brilliant legal mind long before her confirmation to the highest court in the land. On paper, she seemed untouchable. Sterling academic credentials, a professorship, clerking for the late Justice Scalia, and a reputation for sharp, methodical reasoning. To many in Washington's corridors of power, she was the perfect embodiment of judicial authority, unflappable, precise, and unwavering in her ideology. But beneath that polished exterior lay a pattern that revealed itself again and again, a pattern less about justice and more about preserving power. Her rulings often carried the weight of that rigidity. When questions of voting rights reached her bench, Barrett's opinions leaned toward narrowing access rather than expanding it. In cases involving women's autonomy, her reasoning echoed not empathy, but doctrine, narrowing the space for choice and agency. Time and again, she stood not with the vulnerable but with entrenched authority, cloaking each decision in the language of law, while the impact reverberated in the lives of those with the least protection. It wasn't just her decisions but her tone that told the story. Barrett spoke with the authority of someone who believed her word or was beyond reproach. In hearings, she was courteous but cold, offering rehearsed smiles that never reached her eyes. Her answers carried the certainty of someone who expected deference, not dialogue. Critics noted the condescension laced between her lines, the subtle but unmistakable suggestion that dissenters were not simply wrong, but beneath her. Her rise was as much political as it was judicial. From the moment she was nominated, her confirmation became a symbol of partisanship, rammed through at breakneck speed, days before a presidential election. To her supporters, it was a triumph. To her critics, it was the clearest signal that her seat was not born of impartial service, but of power plays. Every ruling she delivered afterward was read not just in the language of law, but in the shadow of that rushed, bitterly divided confirmation. And yet, she wore her robe like armor. With every opinion, every rebuke, every cutting phrase delivered from the bench, she reinforced her image of untouchable authority. For years, she silenced dissent with her robe and gavel. Those who stood before her often shrank beneath that weight, their arguments drowned by the gravity of her position. Her confidence was not simply in her intellect, but in the knowledge that history, tradition, and the machinery of power stood behind her. But authority can be brittle when built on arrogance. Barrett's image, so carefully constructed, so long shielded by the reverence of the institution she represented, began to crack when tested, not by another justice, not by another scholar, but by someone she had underestimated. A representative who didn't fit the mold. A woman who didn't shrink, who didn't bow, who didn't allow the gavel's echo to define the terms of the exchange. On this day, in this trial, Barrett's voice may have echoed as it always had, sharp, commanding, dripping with superiority. But something was different. For the first time, the silence that followed wasn't surrender. It was anticipation. Those who had grown accustomed to watching her dominance play out began to sense it. The shift in balance, the quiet before the storm. The robe no longer seemed so invincible. The gavel no longer promised the final word. But this time, that authority was about to collapse, under the weight of one woman's words. Jasmine Crockett's story did not begin in the marble halls of Washington or in the hushed reverence of a courtroom. It began far from the centers of privilege, in the quiet grind of working-class neighborhoods where dreams were fragile, but determination was the only currency that mattered. She grew up knowing the sharp edges of limitation, what it meant to fight for opportunities others inherited without effort. There were no silver spoons, no family name to clear a path. What she carried instead was grit, sharpened by every door that slammed in her face. From her earliest days, Crockett had been told in subtle and blunt ways alike that she was not meant to stand in places of power. Teachers who underestimated her ambition, colleagues who dismissed her intellect, men who mistook her confidence for arrogance. She had walked into rooms where she was the only black woman present and felt the silence wrap around her like a challenge. She was underestimated so often that it became a kind of fuel. Every laugh behind her back, every sneer that questioned her worth, hardened her resolve. If they thought she didn't belong, she decided, then she would make belonging impossible to ignore. Her entry into politics was not the polished march of the insider, but the uphill climb of an outsider. She didn't inherit a dynasty or step into the shoes of a political family. She built her path from the ground up. She had worked as a public defender, standing shoulder to shoulder with those who had nothing but the Constitution between them and a system stacked against them. She had looked into the eyes of clients society had thrown away and promised them she would not back down. In those cramped offices and tense courtrooms, she learned what justice looked like when stripped of theory and lived in flesh and blood. That experience shaped her in ways textbooks never could. She understood not Jew. It's the letter of the law, but its failures, its loopholes, its cruel tendency to bend toward power unless someone forced it straight. And so, when she stepped onto the political stage, she carried that truth with her. Crockett was not just another representative. She was the embodiment of every person who had been silenced, ignored, or written off. She stood as proof that being underestimated did not mean being powerless. But her rise was not smooth. She faced ridicule from opponents who painted her as too bold, too brash, too unpolished for the stage she claimed. Some called her reckless, others dismissed her as performative. Yet each attempt to box her in only made her more uncontainable. For Crockett, preparation was armor. She studied her opponent's words until she knew them better than they did. She sharpened her arguments with the precision of someone who could not afford to stumble. And when she spoke, it was with a clarity that turned dismissal into regret. Her refusal to bow down was not just stubbornness, it was survival. She knew what it meant to be counted out. She knew how it felt to be spoken over, her words trampled before they had a chance to breathe. So, she trained herself to deliver them in a way that could not be ignored. Every speech, every debate, every confrontation became a rehearsal for the moment she would face the full weight of the establishment. That moment had arrived. Sitting across from Amy Coney Barrett, Crockett carried all those years with her. The long nights of study, the battles fought in smaller courts, the sneers she'd endured from those who believed her voice was too raw, too loud, too inconvenient. She carried the echoes of every client who had whispered, "Fight for me." She carried the pride of communities who saw in her not just a politician, but a vessel of their own resilience. And as she stared down the woman in the black robe, the same old sneer now dressed up in judicial authority, Crockett did not tremble. She did not fold. She sat steady, the calm before an inevitable storm. Every slight, every insult, every attempt to push her back into silence had led to this moment. Everything she had endured, every slight, every insult, was leading to this precise second. The first exchange came like a strike of lightning, swift, bright, and meant to scorch. Barrett's interruption cut through Crockett's words before they had even settled in the air. Her voice was sharp, dismissive, the tone of someone who believed interruption itself was an assertion of dominance. She spoke not to engage, but to silence, layering her objection with clipped authority, as if to remind everyone in the chamber who held the gavel. But Crockett did not flinch. She let the words fall, let the echo of Barrett's sharpness rattle around the chamber, and then answered not with outrage, but with a measured calm that disarmed the sting. Her voice carried weight not by volume, but by precision. Each sentence landed steady, unhurried, as if crafted to expose the emptiness of Barrett's attempt to rattle her. Calmness, Crockett knew, could be sharper than fury, and as she spoke, it was Barrett, not Crockett, who began to look unsettled. Barrett leaned forward, her expression tightening, her words snapping quicker now, laced with irritation. Authority, once assumed, suddenly had to be defended. She doubled down, her language more biting, her tone heavy with arrogance. She sought to corner Crockett, to push her into a stumble, to re-establish control through sheer force of will. The chamber felt the tension rise, like air thickening before a storm. The gallery shifted uneasily. Reporters glanced at one another, pens scratching faster now, sensing the gravity of the clash unfolding. The rhythm of the room had changed. Barrett's interruptions no longer felt like confidence, but desperation. Each attempt to reassert dominance only amplified Crockett's composure. The imbalance was subtle, but growing. The more Barrett pressed, the more Crockett's restraint exposed her as rattled. Crockett's eyes stayed locked forward, unshaken. She let Barrett's words wash over her, not meeting them with fire, but with an almost surgical patience. She responded with clarity, each phrase weighted with intention, her tone steady enough to draw the gallery closer, their attention snapping not to Barrett's sharpness, but to Crockett's control. In that restraint, there was power. In that calm, there was defiance. Barrett's voice grew louder, her cadence harsher, as though volume alone could make up for what she was losing. She interrupted again, cutting off Crockett mid-thought, the sound echoing like a gavel strike. Yet this time, the reaction from the room was different. The discomfort was visible, shoulders stiffening in the gallery, reporters narrowing their eyes, even a few suppressed murmurs from those who found the imbalance distasteful. Barrett's dominance was no longer commanding. It was suffocating. And through it all, Crockett remained a portrait of composure. She let Barrett finish her tirade, then drew a single breath, her silence louder than the interruption. She did not rush, she did not retreat. Instead, she paused, deliberate, steady, as though the moment itself now belonged to her. And then Crockett paused, looked Barrett dead in the eye, and the entire room leaned in. The pause hung in the air, taut as a wire stretched to breaking. Barrett's words, harsh and overbearing, still echoed faintly against the chamber walls, but the silence that followed was no longer her domain. It was Crockett's. She lifted her chin ever so slightly, her eyes locked on Barrett, with a steady intensity that seemed to pierce through the black robe and the layers of authority it symbolized. Then she spoke. Her voice was calm, deliberate and measured, not rushed, not frantic, not defensive. "With all due respect," she began, and the phrase landed not as deference, but as quiet defiance. "You can interrupt me, but you cannot erase me." The words spread through the room like a current, subtle at first, then surging. Reporters snapped their heads up, pens scratching feverishly across notebooks. A few gasps broke from the gallery. The balance had shifted, though few yet realized just how far it was about to tip. Crockett didn't lean on theatrics. She leaned on precision. One by one, she began dismantling Barrett's attack, not with fire, but with facts. Where Barrett had attempted to wield superiority, Crockett met her with clarity. She cited rulings, historical precedents, and the very constitutional principles that Barrett herself had invoked in the past. "If justice means anything," she said, her voice steady, "it means consistency. It means fairness. And it means that authority cannot become arrogance," the gallery murmured. Barrett shifted in her chair, her fingers tapping the bench in a rhythm just barely masking unease. The robe was supposed to protect her, to shield her from looking human. But Crockett's words chipped away at that facade. Then Crockett leaned forward, her tone still calm, but sharper now. Each word honed like the edge of a blade. She reminded Barrett of moments when her decisions had narrowed rights instead of expanding them, cases where the vulnerable had been left without recourse, where precedent had been bent not toward justice, but toward ideology. "You call it interpretation," Crockett said softly. "But for the families who lost their voices in your rulings, it feels like exclusion. For the women whose choices were stripped, it feels like betrayal. For the communities who waited for fairness, it feels like silence." The murmurs grew louder now, a restless energy moving through the chamber. Pens scribbled furiously. Cameras clicked in rapid succession. Even the bailiff's stoicism faltered as he glanced from Barrett to Crockett, sensing the tremor beneath the bench's authority. Barrett tried to cut in again, her voice higher, more urgent this time. But Crockett didn't yield. She spoke over the interruption without raising her voice, a steady stream of truth that drowned out the attempted dismissal. The chamber noticed. What had begun as a duel was now unmistakably a reversal. Barrett looked defensive, her mask of unshakable authority slipping with each passing moment. Crockett's calm became its own spectacle. Her restraint wasn't passivity, it was command. Where Barrett's tone had grown shrill, Crockett's remained unwavering. She turned Barrett's own tactic, interruption, against her, not by matching aggression, but by refusing to give it power. Every pause was deliberate, every phrase calibrated to land with precision. She spoke of history, of how authority had too often been used as a weapon rather than a shield. She invoked the language of the Constitution itself, reminding the court that power is meant to serve the people, not silence them. And with each line, Barrett's composure cracked a little more. Her eyes flickered down at her notes, her lips pressed into a thin line. Her confidence eroded not by a storm of fury, but by the quiet persistence of truth. The gallery was alive now. You could hear the gasps at every revelation, the hurried scribbles of journalists struggling to capture the weight of each phrase. One reporter whispered to another, too loudly to be ignored, "This is history." And indeed, it felt like it, an unplanned, unscripted moment where the tide of power shifted in real time. Then came the final blow. Crockett's voice softened, dropping almost to a whisper, commanding the kind of silence no gavel could enforce. "Judge Barrett, you sit in that robe as if it is the source of your power. But power does not come from robes. It does not come from gavels. It does not even come from courts. Power comes from truth. And truth cannot be interrupted." The words landed like thunder. The room froze, the silence suddenly deafening. Barrett's face faltered, her eyes betraying what her robe could not conceal. The crack of doubt. The sting of being exposed. For the first time, she did not look untouchable. She looked shaken. Crockett leaned back slightly, her gaze never wavering. The chamber seemed suspended in that moment, caught between the authority of the bench and the authority of truth. It was clear now who commanded the room. And as Crockett's final words echoed, the court and the nation realized the balance of power had shifted. The moment Crockett's words hit the air, they did not stay confined to the courtroom. Within minutes, the outside world had seized them, repackaged them, and flung them into the bloodstream of the internet. The first clip surfaced on Twitter before the gavel even struck to adjourn. A 10-second video, shaky but clear, captured Crockett's calm gaze as she declared, "Power does not come from robes. Power comes from truth." By the time the judge's robe had settled back into its folds, the clip had already been retweeted thousands of times. Then came the hashtags. Hashtag Crockett vs. Barrett trended first, climbing the global list within an hour. Close behind it, #Justice flipped. TikTok flooded with edits of the exchange, set to cinematic music, slow-motion zooms on Crockett's unwavering stare. Memes sprouted like wildfire. Barrett's gavel replaced by a crumbling cookie. Crockett depicted as a storm overtaking a fragile umbrella. Captions reminding viewers, "You can interrupt the words, but not the truth." Cable news anchors interrupted their regular programming to play the clip, dissecting every second. Commentators called it the most historic courtroom mic drop of the decade. One anchor, usually cautious with praise, shook his head mid-broadcast and muttered, "That was surgical." Even late-night comedians who typically thrived on cynicism couldn't resist. By the end of the week, Crockett's words had been remixed into monologues, sketches, and even music mashups, her line about truth sampled into a viral dance track. But what startled everyone was not the expected applause from her base, but the nods from unlikely corners. Moderates, independents, even a few conservative voices begrudgingly acknowledged the brilliance of her takedown. "I don't agree with her politics," one pundit admitted, "but you cannot deny the mastery of that moment." The courtroom exchange had transcended party lines. It was no longer just a clash between two women, but a referendum on arrogance versus dignity. Activists seized the energy, weaving Crockett's words into rallies and speeches. "Power comes from truth" became a chant on protest lines, a slogan printed on posters, a banner stretched across city streets. Political leaders echoed the phrase in their statements, linking it to broader fights for justice, equality, and accountability. Even classrooms took notice. Teachers played the clip to students, framing it as an example of courage under fire, proof that authority is not always synonymous with justice. Everywhere, the ripple effect grew. On Instagram, young women posted side-by-side images of Crockett's stare with captions about reclaiming their own power. On YouTube, reaction videos poured in, people watching the courtroom exchange for the first time, shouting, gasping, covering their mouths in disbelief before breaking into applause from their living rooms. One viral video showed an immigrant father watching the clip with his teenage daughter. When Crockett delivered her line, the father whispered, "That is why we came here." Even comedy couldn't strip the gravity from the moment. Late-night jokes about Barrett getting schooled drew laughs, but always circled back to admiration for Crockett's composure. The humor was laced not with mockery of Crockett, but with awe at her control. In every iteration, the message spread. Something extraordinary had happened in that courtroom, but for Crockett, it wasn't about applause. It was about truth. When the dust of the uproar finally settled, Crockett did not bask in the applause. She did not ride the wave of hashtags or the frenzy of cameras. Instead, she returned to the heart of what had driven her into that chamber in the first place. Not ego, not spectacle, but truth. And in that stillness, she chose to reframe the attack that had been hurled at her into something larger, something America could not ignore. She spoke not to Barrett, not even to the courtroom, but to the country. Her voice carried with the weight of history, rising above the pettiness of insult and the brittle posturing of authority. "Authority is not in the robe," she declared, her words slow and deliberate, each one a nail in the coffin of arrogance. "Authority is in the truth." The silence that followed was not emptiness, it was reverence. People leaned forward, not because they wanted to hear, but because they needed to. In that moment, the courtroom transformed from a battleground of egos into a mirror reflecting America's struggle with itself. She pressed on, her tone measured but unflinching. Respect is not commanded, it is earned, and the people of this nation will no longer bow to arrogance simply because it is cloaked in tradition. We have been told to stay quiet, to take our place, to accept less. But dignity cannot be silenced. Justice cannot be delayed. Truth cannot be erased. Each phrase built upon the last, a steady crescendo pulling the audience higher. Listeners were not just witnesses, they were participants in a transformation. Crockett was no longer simply defending herself against Barrett's attack. She was handing America a moral compass. She reminded the room of the countless voices silenced by power, the stories buried by those who hid behind robes, gavels, and titles. But she also reminded them of resilience, of immigrants who worked twice as hard for half the credit, of women who endured dismissal and condescension, of communities that had been told for generations that they did not belong. "Every insult we endure," she said, "is a stone in the foundation of our strength. Every slight, every dismissal, every denial, it all leads to this: a people who will not bow." The room seemed to hold its breath, as if afraid to miss a single syllable. Her words carried the fire of struggle, but also the clarity of hope. She was not just speaking about herself or even about Barrett. She was speaking about a movement, a swelling force that demanded justice not as a favor, but as a birthright. By the end, her voice had softened, but the power of her message had only sharpened. This trial, this attack, this moment, it is not about me. It is about us, about who we choose to be as a nation. Will we surrender to arrogance dressed in titles? Or will we rise with dignity, knowing that truth has always been and will always be the highest authority? And as those final words settled into the air, no one could miss the shift. The attack that was meant to diminish her had become fuel for something far greater. Crockett had taken a dagger and turned it into a torch, lighting the path forward. The audience, inside and outside that chamber, didn't just hear a defense. They heard a call. They felt themselves woven into something larger, part of a rising tide of people who believed, perhaps for the first time in a long time, that justice was within reach. Because this wasn't just her fight, it was theirs, and together it was America's. And so, the story comes full circle. Barrett attacked, but Crockett flipped the entire trial. What began as a display of arrogance ended as a masterclass in dignity. What was meant to silence became the very moment that echoed across the nation. Because when the robe and gavel tried to dictate authority, Crockett reminded us of something deeper, that dignity will always outshine arrogance, that truth will always cut through deception, and that justice will always belong to the people who refuse to bow. This wasn't just a courtroom drama. It was a reminder of what America can be when courage meets conviction. And it's not the last time we'll see voices like Crockett's rise against the weight of old power. It's only the beginning. So, here's where you come in. If you believe in amplifying voices that refuse to be silenced, if you believe that dignity belongs to all of us, then join us. Subscribe and be part of a community that refuses to let these moments pass quietly. Share this story. Remind the world what justice looks like when it's lived, not just spoken. Because every share, every repost, every echo of this moment builds the movement. And most importantly, tell us, what would you have said if you stood in Crockett's shoes? Drop your voice in the comments. Because this is bigger than one trial, one courtroom, or one clash of personalities. This is about us, all of us, deciding who we are and who we choose to be. Barrett attacked. Crockett flipped the trial. But the final word, the true authority, belongs to you.